and gentlemen, and welcome to the high-level conference, Power from Statistics, Delivering the Evidence of Tomorrow. We're here at the MCE Centre in Brussels, and I'd also like to welcome those of you who are watching on the web streaming online live. My name is Aminda Lee. I'm a former BBC journalist and broadcaster, and I now live and work out of Rome. It's my pleasure and my privilege to be one of the moderators at this event, together with Thomas Matraia, who will introduce himself later today. We're here to chair the debates, to make sure that everything runs smoothly, and most importantly, since we have a lot to do, runs to time. It's great to see so many of you here, and we're hoping that more will actually arrive. Brussels traffic is never easy any time of the day, certainly at this time of the morning. And thanks to everyone who's also come from so far as well. We've got many visitors from and speakers from the United States as well, so it'll be good to hear their positions and opinions. And we're going to be spending the next 2 days discussing the future of official statistics. We're going to be hearing more about the background and the aims of this conference from our hosts very shortly. But first of all, I of course need to pass on some brief housekeeping details to you. Wi-Fi is available and it's free. The connection is called MCE BUS, But please do keep your mobiles on silent, though of course while they're on silent you can still tweet. We are really hoping that you send in your questions via Twitter. The main conference hashtag is Power from Statistics. You can see we're trying to do everything very clear and simple for you to make it easy. And we'll be having tweets displayed on the screen as we're going through the conference, and we'll also be discussing the questions sent in on Twitter. During the panel debates, we'll be conducting some live polls via the especially created Power from Statistics app. I hope you've already downloaded it. If not, you do have time during the coffee break. You should have also all received your information, your login and details and username and password. I'll explain a little bit more about how all that voting works once we actually get round to it. After this opening session, where we'll be hearing from our hosts and having a keynote speech on better data for better policy, we'll have that short coffee break, and that's when you can download the app. Then we'll start the first of today's 3 interactive panel discussions on the highly topical subject of keeping up with trends in migration. After lunch, we will have 2 further interactive discussions on sustainable development and communicating statistics in the digital era. And there will also be a keynote speech on the pursuit of objectivity in science and public life, a very topical issue at the moment. At the end of today's proceedings, there is an opportunity for you to network at the social dinner at the 4 Point Hotel by Sheraton, which is just walking distance from this conference centre. You'll find all these details, including the venue maps, the latest programme information, conference documents, and details about the speakers on the Power from Statistics conference app, as well as in your participants package that you got when you came in this morning to register. The conference has been deliberately designed with a lot of interactive elements so you can all take part in the debate, either via Twitter, via the live polls, through the app, and we will also have time for questions from the floor as well on each of our interactive debates. We do hope that you're going to make the most of the opportunities to give your input and to get involved in the proceedings. As you can appreciate, we have a very busy day ahead of us. And so I would like to, without further delay, introduce our conference co-hosts who will be officially opening the proceedings. First, we have Mariana Kotzeva, who's the Acting Director General of Eurostat, the European Union Statistical Office. She's been in the position since January this year. Before she joined Eurostat in 2012, she was head of Bulgaria's National Statistic Institute and held a number of high-level consulting posts in the Bulgarian and foreign administrations, also leading international projects for the United Nations, and the World Bank. Her co-host on stage is Mettler, who is head of the European Political Strategy Centre. For those of you who don't know what this is, it's the European Commission's in-house think tank, providing strategic evidence-based analysis and forward-looking policy advice. Prior to assuming her current position, Anne was Executive Director of the Lisbon Council think tank, and she served as Director for Europe at the World Economic Forum. She also chairs the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System, which aims to strengthen the EU's foresight capacity and governance. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Eurostat's Acting Director General, Mariana Kotzeva.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, esteemed panelists and colleagues from the European Commission, I would like to welcome you all to our conference on behalf of Eurostat. The conference comes in a very important moment in time, moment which is important for everyone in Europe, moment which is crucial for everybody in the world, and not just for us, members of the European statistical community. We all know well, this is our profession, this is our life, this is our passion, that official European statistics are indispensable of the EU decision-making and for the measurement on performance and impact of EU initiatives. High-quality European aggregates, together with the comparable statistics on the individual member states, underpin, just to mention few, the Investment Plan for Europe, Stability and Growth Pact, the European Semester exercise, macroeconomic imbalances, scoreboards, social agenda, and I could continue with other top priorities in numerous other policy domains. Official statistics are also key instruments which enhance the transparency and accountability of the EU policies and enable civic engagement and democratic participation in the political life of European Union citizens. At the same time, we have to admit that today, European statistics is confronted with a new reality, which demands from us a swift and bold responses. Due to the rapid internet advancements and the arrival of new media technologies, we are currently witnessing an explosion of information, the likes of which has never been seen before. Today, European citizens are universally connected and digitally aware. They have a multitude of new data sources at their disposal, access to which couldn't be easier or more tempting. Providers of other non-official data increasingly compete with us, official statisticians, by producing more timely, but often, unfortunately or fortunately, less reliable information. In the post-truth era of social media, fake news, alternative facts, even I have started to notice in the news alternative statistics, trustworthy official statistics are needed more than ever. Their value will only increase with time. We believe in this, but we have to make it happen. At a time when statistical data are increasingly used for political purposes and campaigning, the existence of a trustworthy source which offers online fact-checking possibilities is a real necessity. The fast-changing nature of the issues that EU policies need to address also means that official statistics must be able to react more rapidly. As a result, the world of official statistics needs to evolve to stay relevant. It's a question about our relevance, and that's why it will be not a premature, it will not be a strong statement to say that European statistics is at the crossroads. And we have to go beyond our established credentials. We have to be bold and we have to react swiftly. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear my colleagues, fellow statisticians, I hope that you will agree with me when I say that this new reality we are all confronted with is far from what we might call business as usual, which means that we statisticians must look hard for new and innovative solutions to the challenges which we are facing. And among others, they might include making sure that statistics produced by Eurostat and other members of the European statistical system reach different European audiences and are understood by them. And I don't only mean policymakers, researchers, and academics. Our ambition is to bring sound and solid figures also to the people who 5 or 10 years ago never heard of Eurostat, and they make usually a mistake with Eurostar, which is the famous train line, and they always congratulate me when they ask me where I am working, that I am providing a very good service and on-time trains, but it could be better. So following this logic, at the beginning of this year, Eurostat started a number of initiatives to make our statistics consumable, close to the citizen, used and relevant. We started to invest very heavily, not so much in money because we have some constraints, but at least in our efforts, and to provide data in a new format to complement our regular and well-established news releases. The What's New section on the Eurostat website brings the work of the Eurostat and the European statistical system closer to European citizens by providing them with data that is easily understood by people relative and close to their daily lives. This year, Eurostat has also boosted its presence on social media. In addition to the quickly growing popularity of our Twitter account, we also opened a Facebook account, enlarging our user base and multiplying our statistical messages even further. Let me that in parallel, we have also made significant changes to the look of the Eurostat homepage. This is just the beginning. This is the message for our director on communication, because instead of good morning, I every morning ask, how is Eurostat going to improve its homepage? And then, of course, I'm going to all the initiatives related to providing more and faster statistics. We started with the first experimental publications of flash poverty estimates, early estimates of material deprivation indicators, new statistics skills, labor market flows, and these are just to show that we are really changing the path towards modernization and faster response. Ladies and gentlemen, you understand that this is not the best place and time for me to do a report what Eurostat is doing and what we members of the European statistical systems are doing. At this point, let me only mention that this is just the beginning. And let me focus instead of the ways of dealing with the challenges which we are facing and how, in fact, this initiative, Power from Statistics, was born. We statisticians, we wanted to expand the discussion about the future of official statistics to involve a much wider audience. Because we have this habit, because we are serious people and we like the numbers, we enjoy to speak among ourselves. And this is not always the best approach. Therefore, the basic idea behind the Power from Statistics was to bring industry leaders, policymakers, academics, journalists, and professionals from different important fields together. At first, we maybe the most important idea which Eurostat team put forward was to contact Mettler and European Commission think tank team, because this is the part of the European Commission which always tries to push the well-established ways of working in the Commission to something what should be bold, thinking out of the box and trying to open the Commission to the outside world. And then this was Anne's idea, in fact, that we should do not just an ad hoc event, that should be a kind of process of communication, which started with 5 round tables. We have been selecting topics which we could find an evidence and that they will impact the future of the world, of the European Union, and respectively of official statistics. So this is how the 5 topics emerge: migration, globalization, new economic and business models, sustainability, and the link between science, statistics, policy, and society. For each roundtable, we brought together experts in particular field, and we just moderated discussions between them. Then we asked the participants for written contributions, and you can find those written contributions, those articles summarized in an Outlook report, which is published on the conference website. And I encourage you to have a closer look. This is something what will remain. You could consult it. I hope that it will inspire you for your future activities. Let me add that I had the privilege to open the very first roundtable a year ago in Bratislava. And this was the first roundtable which was devoted to migration. And then, even in this first roundtable, when we didn't know how it will work, we just bring the nice people together, and I think this was enough. So then you see the friendly and dynamic atmosphere, their dedication to ask as many as possible questions, and to be very demanding to statisticians with so many wishes, and we are grateful for that, because this is exactly what we were aiming for. And then, since the first roundtable devoted to migration, I have been informed by my team that the spirit of this initial brainstorming meeting was replicated at all of the other roundtable events. This might have been because we asked the participants in roundtables discussion to be creative and bold in their thinking, but I think that by definition they are like such kind of people, and we are looking forward to continue the cooperation with them in that respect. I am delighted to say that now we have, as a follow-up of the roundtables, we have these 2 days of intensive discussion, and hopefully lively debates are ahead of us. As you may have read in our conference program, and as already was mentioned in the introduction by our moderator, we will be concentrating on these important topics which will shape the future of Europe and future of official statistics. The challenge will be to focus in our discussion to see what kind of information needs will be there in the next maybe 10 years, even more, and to provide enough questions to us to which we have to answer. So in this way, to give us the possibility to concentrate and to transfer these wishes in real actions, which will be embedded in the next European Statistical Program, which will start beyond 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, while we were organizing our conference, we wanted the statistical community to fully benefit from everything that our democratic societies have to offer. It is for this reason that our conference unites so many different parts of society, bringing together experts and professionals from both the public and private sector. We are very grateful that so many speakers and panelists have accepted our invitation to contribute to the conference today or to the round table. We will hope that they will continue to cooperate with us in the future. As it was announced, providing online watching of the conference, and also we will encourage the discussions via Twitter. This was already announced. Finally, I would like to say again that the Power from Statistics initiative would not have been possible without the support of so many partners and friends. Several national statistical institutes hosted our round table discussions, actively contributing to their debates. Thank you very much for the nice organization, atmosphere, and spirit. Policy Directors General via their experts joined the roundtables. Some of them are present in the room again. Welcome to the colleagues, and thank you very much. I also thought the articles published on the conference are absolutely voluntary contributions to table participants who devoted their time and expertise. It is to their dedication that today we have this rich material to discuss at the conference, but also reflect on it in the future. At the very first stages of Power from Statistics, we sought guidance on how exactly to shape this forward-looking initiative. and who was in the better position to help us in this respect than the European Commission think tank, the EPC Center. And my dear friend Anne, it was their idea, as I said, to organize the roundtables that would precede our conference. It's also the EPC that sent their experts to every roundtable and help us with their conclusions. It is therefore a great pleasure for me to hand over to Anne, who has accompanied me in this idea, which we were not sure at the beginning how it will work, at every stage of this exciting journey. So, Anne, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mariana. And just to say that the feeling is completely mutual. We have also tremendously enjoyed the cooperation. I want to warmly thank you, but also your team and all the colleagues at Eurostat. It's really been a fascinating journey. But let me say that today is really, at least for me, much more than an event. It is really an illustration for me of a new way of working at the Commission, and I think Mariana already alluded to it. I think over the past three years, we have worked really very, very hard to bring down silos and to form interdisciplinary, cross-cutting project teams that I believe and hope have made our policies more comprehensive, robust, and more informed. And today, a special project team really, I think, comes here together at a special time. We already said the European Strategy Center and that. So, presenting policy advice on the one hand and world-class statistics on the other. And marriage between facts and political strategy may seem obvious. Policymakers, of course, need to be evidence-based and evidence-informed. But just like the world does not stand still either, statistics. What has been the of digital productivity? How can we understand trade statistics when the fastest growing segment of actually trade in data, no longer products? And how do we reflect in statistics the changing world of work, where the demand is now greatest for those with non-routine interactive skills? And how do we measure innovation when so much of it is no longer only the result of R&D and patents, also and business model and workplace innovation? These are questions that I have, and I'm sure you have many others. You know the famous saying that what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. And by the same token, what gets measured gets done. If that's true, the discussion over the next 2 days could not be more important. Statistics can help make sense of a changing world. They can guide policymakers into what works, but also what doesn't. But only if we measure what needs to get measured. And it is for this reason that we wanted to team up with Eurostat on this important discourse, which is not only a service to policymakers and experts, but really to all people who cherish democracy, accountability, and freedom. In a world, it was already said, in a world where fake news and disinformation are sadly becoming the new normal, it is indispensable that citizens have access to unbiased, trustworthy statistics that hold policymakers to account and that shed light on their performance and that allows them to make an informed decision at the ballot box. I looked up a paper that I wrote back in 2009 yesterday, and it's called Innovating Indicators. And in this paper, I called for a better, more accurate reflection in official statistics of new economic, social, and environmental realities. So essentially, conflict in this entire process is about, which is also why for me it is so incredibly gratifying. I also pointed out that how data is used, and especially how we make it easily accessible to the largest number of people, is equally important. So data visualization, storytelling with data, using data to help us better understand global trends, using output data rather than just input data. All of this I consider very important if we want to take statistics out of what is, by all accounts, a very narrow realm of policymakers and policy experts, fairly into the middle of society where important public policy debates and reflections are taking place. It is for this reason I am very excited to announce as the keynote speaker this morning, Stefaan Verhulst, co-founder and chief research and development officer of the governance laboratory at New York University. Stefaan is of European descent with a very, very distinguished background, ranging from Oxford University and the Markle Foundation to the Central European University in Budapest. But let me also say a word about the very impressive work of the GovLab, which is the acronym. So the GovLab, which you co-founded together with Beth Novak, who previously served in the Obama White House as a first U.S. Deputy Chief Technology Officer. So the GovLab wants to improve people's lives by changing the way we govern. And in your mission statement, you state, and I quote, "We believe that the increased availability and use of data, new ways to leverage the capacity and intelligence and expertise of people in the problem-solving process, combined with new advances in technology and science, can transform governance. The GovLab approaches each challenge and opportunity in an interdisciplinary, collaborative way, irrespective of the problem, sector, geography, and level of government," end quote. Sounds fascinating, and I'm sure I speak also on behalf of Mariana and everyone here in the room that we're very grateful you can be with us. We look forward to your keynote presentation this morning. Please help me welcome Stefaan Verhulst.
Thanks so much, and quite a daunting task after an introduction like that from Anne, so thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here because for a variety of reasons. One is obviously this is a crucial topic in today's society, but also I'm very much impressed with what Eurostat has been doing. I mean, I've been working on changing statistics for today's society in a variety of ways, but what Eurostat is trying to do and what Eurostat is doing really is the leadership from many statistical agencies that I have seen. And so when they asked me to be part of this conference, I was delighted to join. And then I got the message that I should talk about better data for better policy, which is kind of a daunting task, which is, anyway, a huge topic. And so if it's feasible to put the presentation up. So what I've tried to do in order to address this huge topic of better data for better policy is what every researcher traditionally does, is to basically narrow it down according to a few premises. And so what I will try to do today is reflect on 3 premises, and of course premises need to be tested, and that's why I call them premises, and then reflect on those premises at the end on how can we actually establish them and how can we ultimately implement them. And the first premise is a premise that is dear to my heart, if I can figure out how this works. See, meaning we work a lot around new technology, but it doesn't mean I know how to use it. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I could just ask to give the next slide.
Yes, please.
If that's the easiest option. Anyway, so I will have a tasking division right now. So the first premise that I would like to start with, which is a premise that is, as Anne said, is a premise that is dear to our heart, is that data not only is important to inform policy, but actually can also transform the full policy cycle. It works, so thanks. So if we think about policy, quite often we think about what is the outcome of a policy process. But from a data point of view, from my point of view, it's necessary to think in terms of the different stages that informs policy, and then especially looking at what stage is data important. And my premise, to a large extent, is that data is not just important at the end stage, which is quite often evidence-based policy making, which is what worked and what was the impact, but is actually important at every stage of the policy cycle. And more importantly, the use of data can also transform the policy cycle, because to a large extent, the existing policy cycle is clearly more of a sequential policy cycle that was applicable to a different age, but that we also have to start thinking about changing the policy cycle. And so whether it's about agenda setting, I mean, what topic is important for society to be addressed from a policy point of view, to prioritization on how are we going to address the policy, to ultimately defining the problem, or whether it's about the design of the solutions in order to address the problem, or whether it's about actually iterating and testing out whether the prototype that has been developed actually works, whether it's about implementation and enforcement, or whether it's about evaluation. At every element of the policy stage, you actually have data that can inform the stage, but it's more importantly, and as said, this is something that is very dear to our heart because that's what the whole mission of GovLab is. It can also transform the way you go about the implementation of each stage. And it goes, it can change and inform and transform, from my perspective, in 4 ways. And as Marina was indicating, what are the specific needs? And from my point of view, for statistical agencies and for data in society, from my point of view, there are 4 types of needs, 4 ways in which data can actually inform the policy cycle. And the first one is about providing better situation analysis, so that you ultimately know what is the situation that we start from, what is the situation in which a policy environment happens. And so here an example, and I apologize, several of those examples will be more from North America, but it might also be good to not deal too much with European politics, so that's why I also on the safe side perhaps. But the first example is, of course, which is currently the one of the most important crises in the US, which is the opioid crisis, which is basically is the addiction to prescription drugs. And in order to really develop policies to a crisis, whether it's following a hurricane or whether it's during, for instance, a drug addiction crisis, you obviously have to know what is the problem in order to define the best solution. And so one example here on how data is contributing to a better situational analysis is the use of big data as it relates to prescription practices in order to really understand where are drugs prescribed the most, where are those drugs ultimately given through pharmacies, and how does that inform ultimately a policy environment in order to address the opioid crisis. And so that's just one example for getting a better situational analysis. And clearly the situational analysis does not inform the fact that there is a crisis, which is of course important to have, and it provides also legitimacy that actually you deal with a problem that is important enough to be dealt with. But it also is important at the different stages, because surprise, surprise, if you don't have a good description of the situation, how will you then ultimately measure whether you had an impact? So situational analysis is not important to become smarter about the situation. It is also important to then ultimately identify the indicators of impact. And so another example that situational analysis informs the whole cycle, because it also ultimately starts with informing what is the priority to then ultimately informing what should be measured. This is another example by Pew Research Center, who is a partner of GovLab in our research network around changing the way we govern. And so here, I know we will talk about the migration, but here they try to basically assess what are the search terms that migrants are searching in Turkey. Knowing that they are searching in Arabic, and as you all know, Turkey is not an Arabic-speaking country, so that you basically could use Arabic searching as a proxy of actually migrants searching certain kinds of terms. And it turns out that they, for instance, were searching a lot about Greece. And that indicated that if you have a search term wave about Greece, then it turns out that 2 months later, you saw actually a lot of those migrants moving into Greece. And so it became a proxy to ultimately understand, actually, and I will talk about migrants as well, became a proxy about a situation analysis, and in this case, it was about search terms that could inform policy making, because if there is suddenly a huge boom in interest in a particular kind of term or interest in a particular kind of country, then that will provide an insight with regard to situational analysis. And again, this then can inform the solution design. You can actually design then ultimately responses to a wave, for instance, as it relates to search term. The second way, next please. The second way the data can inform and change the policy cycle is by ultimately improving knowledge creation. Meaning situational analysis, while some of the examples that I already gave clearly go a little bit beyond traditional situational analysis, but situational analysis normally is about describing reality. It's not about informing how reality works. And so knowledge creation to a large extent is about really trying to understand causalities, really trying to understand correlations between one event and the other event. And so here, for instance, we all, of course, have been aware of the hurricane season in the Americas. And for instance, a particular kind of question that can be answered by data is to what extent will the floods that have been produced by hurricanes, to what extent will that lead to more vector-based diseases or mosquito-driven kind of diseases following the floods? And that will be important because then you can develop policies, you can develop interventions that are far more informed. And so here is, for instance, an example where you start using open data. For instance, data that was generated by the specific cities in the post-Harvey region with regard to how many mosquitoes did they ultimately gather, because that's a data set that can be collected, but also how many calls did they get from citizens with regard to mosquitoes. And as a result, you could actually see a spike of mosquitoes following the hurricanes, and as a result, you can actually have a better response from a policy and from a public health perspective as well. So that's knowledge creation as an example. Other example here is about the climate change, which we are somewhat part of as well, which is the Global Pulse Initiative at the UN, in order to develop access to data, in order to become smarter, not about climate change, but especially about the impact of climate change, so that you can see causalities with regard to increased temperatures, for instance, and then the impact, whether it's on trade, whether it's on public health, or whether it's on the environment as a whole. So that's the second example on how data can inform the policy cycle, because knowledge creation, in addition to situational analysis, will allow you to provide insight in the root causes and will allow you, from a policymaker point of view, to really design, ultimately, interventions that deal with the priority. This third way and the third information need, from my perspective, is about prediction, so that we can learn from the past and try to inform the future. If we have, of course, a large enough sample. And many of you are statistics, and of course, many of you know the dangers of prediction in itself, and there are several modelers here that probably are doing this on a daily basis. But prediction is a third kind of data value proposition as it relates to the policy cycle. And so here an example where ultimately data is being used to predict suicidal behavior. And we also, GovLab has a project in India at the moment where we also start using search results in order to predict suicidal behavior among teenagers, for instance. And then you start understanding that indeed, when you see a certain wave of suicide, that might have implications for more suicide. The famous Werther and Goethe already had some insights in the viral aspect of suicide. But you can actually also, from a policy point of view, intervene. The other example of prediction is with regard to, for instance, if it's hard to identify wealth, and how can you predict wealth in society, for instance, in situations like Rwanda. You can actually start using data, and in this case, telecom data, in order to assume that certain kind of telecom behavior reflects a certain kind of wealth that one has. And so as a result of using this data set, you can also predict a certain kind of wealth. And again, from a policy point of view, it's very important to ultimately know. And then the fourth, which is of course the typical kind of evidence-based kind of practice, but the fourth way data can inform and change and transform the policy cycle, it's obviously through evaluation and impact assessment. And here, it's not only at the end, because typically, of course, we are used to the long-term randomized control kind of approaches where you have, anyway, 5 years in a policy, you ultimately know whether it worked. Ultimately, it's about more rapid kind of randomized control and a rapid evaluation and impact assessment so that you can iterate as you are developing the policy. And so example here is an example about Vision Zero, which is about traffic accidents and how can we decrease traffic accidents to zero in certain kinds of urban areas. Initially developed in Sweden, but now basically taken over worldwide, including New York City, where they are starting to use data to ultimately model how you design, for instance, roads and how that has an impact on ultimately traffic accidents, and how can you do this in a more rapid environment so that you can actually design the roads as you are collecting the data with regard to the impact on Vision Zero. Other example is an example around Sport England, for instance, which was really about how can we increase girls' participation in sports. And so here they started to use data as they are developing a campaign in order to increase the use of sport, or to increase the sports activity by girls, and they found out that most girls were at a certain level of fear with regard to engaging in certain kinds of sports, and so by doing the campaign, they then ultimately saw that this led to different kind of behavior, and the campaign led to 1.6 million girls actually engaging more in sports as a result of a data-driven kind of campaign, which was by impact assessments of what the messages were as they were going along. And so, from my point of view, the data-driven policy cycle is a policy cycle that is informed by better situation analysis, so that you know what is the situation in which you operate, by better knowledge creation, so that you actually have an insight about causalities, you have an insight with regard to certain kind of correlations that you can take into account when you develop policies, and also where you actually have a predictive capability that you can assume that you do, or there is a certain kind of condition that it will probably lead to another kind of condition over time, and ultimately that you also have a better impact assessment. So a data-driven policy cycle is this policy cycle that at each stage of the cycle is informed by those four kinds of value propositions as it relates to data. Now, here's the challenge. This is ultimately advocating for more agile policymaking. This is advocating for policymaking that is rapid, is data-driven, is evidence-based. Now, in order to achieve that mission and vision of agile data policy, ultimately you require data sets that are fine-grained, but especially that are also time-sensitive, right? That are quite often real-time data. And so that leads me to my second premise, right? So my first premise was about that data can inform every stage of the policy cycle, and more importantly, by doing so, you actually transform the policy cycle in making it more agile, more data-driven. But the second premise is that in order to do so, we, and especially here, the statistical community, will also have to have access quite often to other new data sources. And so new data sources can make the policy cycle more agile and informed. And from my point of view, there are three important new data sources that we need to start leveraging more. One is open data, two is citizen sourcing and sources, and third is private data. Now, open data, or opening up government data sets, clearly has had a lot of impact, meaning at GovLab, we have a whole open data line of activity, and this is one example of one of our reports that has tried to assess the impact of open data. And clearly, open data has impact across a variety of areas. But one, and especially for this conference, is of course that open data can actually also improve the way we govern by first making government more data-driven and accountable, and secondly, by ultimately having also public services designed as a result of open data. And interesting is that open data quite often provides government agencies the opportunity to access the data of their colleague agencies. And so open data is not only data for society at large, but open data, from my point of view, has potentially the highest impact in government, because suddenly you actually have access to data sets that quite often were hard to get if they were not made open in general. And so here, I'm not going to go into detail, but here are a few case studies that are available on our website, odimpact.org, where open data had an impact on the way government made policies, whether it was about opening up address information, for instance, in Sweden, or whether it was about opening up just revenue data, budget data, so that you could also have a better insight about the budget and cost inefficiencies within government. Second new data source is, of course, using citizens as data sources, using citizens in order to collect. And this is an example of a project that we initiated, which is the Open 17, which is basically a citizen science initiative to collect data with regard to the 17 SDGs. I mean, how are we going to become smarter about sustainable development goals? And here we are ultimately developing a citizen science initiative in order to get citizens collect data with regard to the situation, or quite often the impact as it relates to SDGs. Another example is one that was recently launched by the BBC, but I thought was a very interesting example. So the BBC is developing a whole new BBC4 documentary about pandemics. And as a result, they also launched an app that can be downloaded by the viewers in order to measure potential behavior during pandemics, and also understand better information about where would you go during a pandemic. And so you get a better sense about potential behavior of pandemics, and is very important from a public health point of view. And it's a very interesting example where public service broadcasting can actually increase its realm of broadcasting into actually citizen science together with researchers. And then, of course, the third new data source, which is the one where I'm going to spend most time on, if I still have some time, is private data. And so clearly, as Marina was indicating, we have seen the increased abundance of data being collected by the private sector, whether it's about web crawling, whether it's about social media data, whether it's telecom data and call detail records, whether it's sensor and geospatial data, especially at the time of the Internet of Things. And we just have to look at this room. There are probably already 100 sensors here in front of me. And so the question is, how do we use that sensor kind of data for achieving the 4 value propositions around data that I started with that can inform the policy cycle. And then lastly, of course, commercial transactions as well, which are more and more digitally captured. And so those private data sources are the data sources that quite often and still are locked. And so one of the big tasks, of course, is how to unlock those data sources for policy making. And of course, not only unlock, but how can we also make advances in actually the science to use those data sources. And so here are some of the new scientific methods that have to be and will be more and more important as it relates to actually leveraging those private data sources to inform the policy cycle. And leads me to my third premise, that if we focus on private data as a real objective to have access to in order to inform and transform better policies, we're going to have to develop new kinds of partnerships, because it is very unlikely that private data will be shared just like open data, like open government data. I mean, it is very unlikely and quite often naive to think that corporations will just open their data sets so that statistical agencies can use them to innovate how they go about measuring reality. So we really have to become smarter about how can you engage with the private sector around data, around informing the policy cycle using private data. And so here, my third premise is that we need new kinds of public-private partnerships, which we at GovLab have started to call data collaboratives. And so what we've done at GovLab is actually map existing practices of data collaboratives. And so at the moment, we have about 100 plus examples in our database where corporations have shared data for public good, and we have tried to make sense of how this happened. And it turns out that there is no one way of actually sharing corporate data. There are 6 types of data collaboratives that are emerging, and it is important to understand those 6 types of data collaboratives because those 6 types have a certain level of openness, right? There's I call it the shades of openness of corporate data, but also different levels of ultimately collaboration. The first one that I want to focus on very briefly is data pooling, where you basically have a cooperative where different data sets are shared together and authorized users have access to those data sets. Quite often, the most preferred way, especially for statistical agencies, to have access to certain kind of data, but it's also interesting for corporations, for instance, that they might have access to other data sets as a result of actually data pooling. This is an example in California. As you all know, California has a bit of a water problem, but how can you become smarter about the situation of the water problem is, for instance, by a data collaborative. It's called the California Data Collaborative, where they pool all the data that corporations and utilities have with regard to water security. The second type of data collaborative is where you have a prize or a challenge around data. And so you open up a particular kind of data set, and then you call upon society or dedicated researchers to make sense of the data from a policy or from a public good perspective. And here, for instance, this is the BBVA. I can't see the logo, somehow it got cut off, but BBVA, the Spanish bank that has held on set occasions prizes and challenges around their banking data. And so they open up banking data, of course de-identified, and then you can actually have researchers step up. And for instance, the prize here was to a group of researchers that made sense with regard to how underserved populations can be served better using banking data, for instance, as such. The third one is through partnerships. This is an example of our partner at MIT, where we also have an affiliation, which is the Laboratory for Social Machines, that basically has a partnership with Twitter in order to use the Twitter feed to make sense of certain situations. And for instance, they have something called Electome, where they use Twitter feeds to predict election outcomes. But they also use Twitter data to, for instance, identify urban challenges. And so that's a partnership between Twitter and, in this case, MIT, with regard to using private data for public good. The other example where actually the sharing of data is more limited but is still valuable is what I call new data tanks. So we have think tanks, Anne was head of one. We call ourselves quite often a do tank. But what I see more and more happening is actually the creation of data tanks. And those data tanks can be within corporations. And so what has happened here, for instance, is JP Morgan Chase, which is the largest bank in the US, has created its own data tank. And data tank, or an institute, the JP Morgan Chase Institute, very original name, but the data tank basically leverages its own data and then shares the insight, the intelligence that it gained from the data back to society. And it's equally important as having access to data. Of course, the question is, of course, anyway, reproducibility and so on. But here, JP Morgan Chase has frankly become the second economic statistical agency in the US. because now they have identified new economic indicators based upon the banking data that they have, and can also actually quite often predict consumer pricing, for instance, far better than the economic statistical agencies, because they have a much richer kind of data set as such. APIs, which is of course nirvana, where you actually can pull the data. Here, example, Zillow. Zillow is the largest data holder of real estate information in the US. If you ever are in the US and you want to rent a room, or you want to buy a house, you will have to go to Zillow in order to identify the real value of housing. But they also make their data available, so that you ultimately have, from a data point of view, you have true access to actually pricing in housing, pricing in rents. You can see gentrification as it happens. And so this is an example that private data contributes to the public good. And then trusted intermediaries is the sixth type of data collaborative, where an intermediary is trusted to provide access to their data. A lot happening. This is Dalberg, which is the trusted intermediary for various telecom operators. And so they say you don't ask the telecom operator, you ask Dalberg whether you can have access to telecom data in certain kinds of contracts. So the question, and here very quickly, because I'm running out of time, I see, but the question is, of course, great, we know that data, private data, can be used to now fulfill those value propositions of data with regard to the policy cycle. Will they do it? I mean, is it not naive? Each time when I tell people that I work around unlocking private data for public policy, they always look at me as if I'm naive, which I'm sure I am. But the question is, of course, what are the incentives? And so we also studied the incentives, why corporations are actually sharing and would be willing to share. And I'm not going to go into detail, but there are around 6 important ones, ranging from reciprocity, i.e. I give something, but I get something back, quite often access to expertise, to ultimately retainment of talent, for instance. And also I've written about that this is the new corporate social responsibility of the data age, where you actually start sharing your data for public good, is the real potential. Now, clearly, besides being naive about will they share the data and why would they share the data, the other reason why people believe I'm naive is because obviously it involves a certain set of risks if you have access to corporate data. And so this is an example of New York City, where the Taxi and Limousine Commission basically collects all private data of all taxi companies, including Uber, Lyft, Juno, and all the 100 other kind of, at the moment, taxi hailing companies. And so they collect all this data, and the data is very granular. It goes about what was the trip, where was the drop-off, what was the pick-off, how much tip was given to the driver, what was the level of satisfaction, and so on. And at a certain point in time, they decided to make that data available. And so they made it de-identified and made it available, and this is what happened. Meaning a few days later, civic hackers had aggregated the data set with other data sets, and now we're able to identify celebrity movements, and so could actually identify what celebrity was picked up where and where were they dropped, and if you are interested in celebrities, where you should be in order to probably catch celebrities in the future. But they also could identify who was dropped at certain so-called gentlemen clubs, which are basically striptease clubs in New York. And of course that embarrassed a huge amount of New Yorkers, because now suddenly they were made transparent about who is actually going to those gentlemen clubs. But obviously, and New Yorkers are not traditionally a lot to be embarrassed about, but the question is, of course, if this would be other data in other contexts where ultimately it might be more volatile, then obviously this would not be a matter of embarrassment, would quite often be a matter of life and death if that data ultimately can be de-identified. And so clearly we have to be sensitive to the concerns, and there are basically 4 concerns as it relates to private data and using private data for public policy. The privacy one and security one is the most well known. The other one, and this is what the statistical agencies are of course most familiar with, is the actually generalizability and representativeness of the data, because clearly corporate data quite often is not as representative as some of the products you work with. We deal with so-called data invisibles, right? So people that are not in the data set and quite often will never be in the data sets because quite often some of the population have not actually reached the level of wealth and engagement to actually use certain kinds of services. And so you will always have that kind of data invisibility and of course the data quality, but also competitive concerns, because clearly the least what corporations want is to have that data being used by their competitors. And then of course also cultural challenges. I always make the joke that I have not met a single person within corporations and actually frankly within government that got promoted because they shared data. Normally it's the opposite, right? They get promoted because they prevented harm of happening. And so we need to change the culture of actually pro-sharing, and that it actually is a good thing to do. I have a whole talk about how can we establish data responsibility. It's about becoming smarter about risk assessment across the value chain, because there are risks at the collection, there are risks at the processing, analyzing, and how do we become smarter about the different risks and how can we mitigate that in a manner that is not cumulative. Because if you ignore one risk, it actually down the line, if you for instance have bad or dirty data, down the line your analysis will also be dirty. Surprise, surprise. So that's the real challenge. But more important here is that it's not important to just assess risk. It's also important to assess the value, because there could be an opportunity risk by not sharing data, right? At the time of crisis, if you don't share data, for instance, people's lives might be at stake. And so what is the opportunity risk of not sharing data? We need new principles. We need new methods. For instance, this is a method where you actually start posing questions, so an expert system instead of a 130-page policy. Where you actually have a new method of assessing and informing the risk. So let me end, because I probably went over time and I apologize, but it's a large topic. Let me end by reflecting on how can we now actually making those three premises true, right? Informing the policy cycle and transforming it by using new data sources in a fashion that is collaborative. And from my point of view, we have to focus on 4 elements. One, we have to establish what I call the profession of data stewards, meaning anyone here in the room who has ever tried to have access to corporate data, good luck. First of all, it's very hard to find a person you have to talk to, because the person quite often is not really identified as that's the person who can sign off on data. And it's very hard to then even create a sustainable relationship, because that person might move over time, and that means that your whole dependency on the data collapses. And so we need professionalizing the data stewards from the corporation, in the corporation. We need to create a new function, and that's my next big project that I'm working on right now, is what is the profession of data steward. It's not a chief privacy officer, it's not a researcher, it's not the data officer. It actually is a unique profession that needs to be established as the go-between with, for instance, statistical agencies as well. Secondly, we need new methods. And I'm not talking about just data science methods. We need actually new methods to define the problem. Turns out, and as Anne said, we do a lot of work on actually approaching problem solving in new ways. And it turns out one of the hardest things that policymakers have is define the problem. They are very bad in defining the problem. They quite often know the solution, but when it comes to understanding the problem, then it's very hard. And it does not mean, because one alert that I need to make, it does not mean that we need to have paralysis by analysis, right? So we don't need to have more data analysis and then ultimately nothing happens, but it does mean that we need to become smarter about how we define the problem. Thirdly, we need evidence about what works. I always say that each time when I talk to people in the data space is very little data driven. There's actually very little data about using data. We don't know what the evidence is of actually using data on the policy cycle. So we need to become smarter about what's the impact of, for instance, new kinds of statistics on the policy cycle. So we need evidence, and we need to actually have the same kind of agility that we are hoping policymakers will have. And then lastly, and this is why I'm here, is that we need to establish a whole movement, and I see Eurostat is at the forefront of that movement, to really change the way we go about data, to inform every aspect of the policy cycle, and by doing so, ultimately transform the policy cycle and make better policies as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan. Inspiring as usual. You understand why we select the keynote speaker. I didn't want to interrupt you because I know your work, and I'm sure that there are so many questions which you raised, and this was exactly the purpose. So we are already in the coffee breaks, So I suggest that if you have questions, I guess you'll be around in the coffee break. So you could approach Stefan, and we will publish, of course, the presentation, and we will continue the cooperation. I hope I see many fellow chief statisticians here. So I saw in their eyes impatience and giving me sign that you have to visit us more often, inspiring us with questions. So now I will pass the floor to Aminda, so we are in your nice hands to say us what will be the next step.
Great, okay, and as you said, we are already in the coffee break, but I think it was definitely worth it, the incredible amount of information. I think we could spend the whole conference just talking about your speech. We are going to keep to time, though, so I would like you, it's going to be a very quick coffee break for you. Just go and get a coffee downstairs where you were this morning, so down the stairs, and keep going to the left, and we're in the sort of circular area bit. And if you haven't done so already, please do download the conference app, because we'll be having our first live polls during the next session, which is talking about trends in migration. I see people have already been